If you're enjoying these stories, you can support us on Patreon. There are several unique stories over there that I haven't uploaded to YouTube. Please consider supporting me on Patreon if you can. Now, let's get into the story. The Adventure of Vamberry the Wine Merchant. In glancing over the records of those singular cases which it has been my privilege to share with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I find many which have already been laid before the public, and a goodly number which have remained hidden within the dark recesses of my tin dispatch box. Somewhere among the notes detailing the Tarleton murders, the case of the old Russian woman Vigoroda, and the singular affair of the aluminum crutch, there lies a thick bundle of papers tied with a faded red ribbon. Upon the outer wrapper, written in my friend's precise angular hand, is the inscription, "It was a case that occurred in our earlier days together, a time when Holmes was still consolidating his reputation as the foremost consulting detective in Europe." I have previously alluded to this investigation in passing, specifically when recounting the curious events of the Musgrave ritual, but I have never before set down the full and extraordinary facts of the matter. It is a narrative that perfectly illustrates not only the bizarre and outre problems that were naturally drawn to my companion, but also the astonishing breadth of his out-of-the-way knowledge. The year was 1880-something, and the month was early May. The raw, biting winds of April had surrendered to a sudden, unseasonable warmth that settled over London like a heavy woolen blanket. Baker Street was baked in the pale spring sunlight, though within our sitting-room the atmosphere was altogether less pleasant. Holmes had been engaged for 2 days in a malodorous chemical investigation seeking to isolate a specific alkaloid from the soot of a coal fire. The room was thick with the acrid fumes of hydrochloric acid, and my friend, his sleeves rolled up to his sharp elbows and his fingers stained with acid, hovered over his retorts and test tubes with the intense, unblinking focus of a medieval alchemist. "A thoroughly satisfactory result, Watson," he remarked suddenly, breaking a silence that had lasted since breakfast. He stepped back from the mahogany table, wiping his hands upon a chemical-stained cloth. "I have proven conclusively that the presence of this particular soot compound can place a suspect within 3 yards of a specific type of industrial furnace used only in the smelting of copper. It is a trifle, perhaps, but the threads of a hanging rope are made of such trifles." "I am delighted to hear it," I replied, coughing slightly as a fresh waft of noxious vapour drifted toward my armchair. "Though I confess I should be even more delighted if we might open a window." Holmes chuckled, a low, quiet sound, and strode across the room to throw up the sash. The clamour of the London streets immediately filled the room, accompanied by the rattle of hansom cabs and the distant shouts of costermongers. "You must forgive me, Watson," he said, throwing himself into his deep cane-backed chair and drawing his knees up to his chin. "My mind rebels at stagnation. Give me problems, give me work, give me the most abstruse cryptogram, or the most intricate analysis, and I am in my own proper atmosphere. But when the criminal world of London is idle, as it appears to be this week, I am forced to manufacture my own puzzles." "Perhaps the criminal world is simply enjoying the spring weather," I suggested, laying aside my copy of the "Crime, Watson, is not deterred by the blooming of the daffodils," Holmes replied, his grey eyes staring fixedly at the ceiling. "It merely changes its cloak." However, I suspect my period of enforced idleness is about to come to an end." "Indeed. Have you received a telegram?" "No, but I hear the heavy measured tread of a man in deep distress ascending our 17 steps. A man of substance, Watson, accustomed to authority, yet presently propelled by an anxiety that overcomes his natural dignity." Before I could ask how he had deduced such particulars from the mere sound of footsteps on the stairs, the door to our sitting-room was flung open. Mrs. Hudson appeared for a fraction of a second, but she was instantly brushed aside by the man who stood upon our threshold. He was a remarkably imposing figure, standing well over 6 feet, with the broad chest and expansive waistline of a man who has lived exceedingly well. He was dressed in a frock coat of the finest black broadcloth, with a silk cravat and a heavy gold Albert chain draped across his waistcoat. Yet, despite his prosperous attire, his appearance was one of utter disarray. His face, which nature had clearly intended to be rubicund and jovial, was of a ghastly doughy pallor. His thinning grey hair was dishevelled, his brow was beaded with perspiration, and his eyes darted wildly about the room like those of a hunted animal. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he gasped, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "I am he," my friend replied, rising gracefully and waving a long, languid hand toward a vacant armchair. "And this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, before whom you may speak as freely as before myself. Pray, take a seat, Mr. Vamberry, for I perceive that your walk from the Thames embankment has somewhat winded you." The stranger started so violently that his top hat tumbled from his trembling hands onto the carpet. "You know me, sir? And you know from whence I have come?" "I know only what you have the goodness to tell me," Holmes said, an amused twinkle in his eye. "The initials A.V. are stamped in gold upon the lining of your hat, and I happen to know that the esteemed firm of Alexander Vamberry and Sons, wine merchants, holds a prominent position in the city. As for the embankment, the peculiar greyish-white chalk dust upon the left toe of your boot is only to be found in the vicinity of the newly excavated wharves near Queen Hithe, where I presume your primary cellars are located." Our visitor collapsed heavily into the armchair, pulling a large silk handkerchief from his pocket and mopping his brow. "It is exactly as they said. You are a wizard, Mr. Holmes, a veritable wizard. I was advised by Lord Holdhurst himself to seek your counsel when the police proved utterly useless." "The police are excellent men, but they are frequently burdened by a lack of imagination," Holmes murmured, reaching for his briar pipe. "Now, Mr. Vamberry, I perceive that you have suffered a severe shock. Compose yourself, I beg of you, and tell me precisely what extraordinary sequence of events has brought a man of your position to my rooms in such a state of agitation." Vamberry took a deep, shuddering breath. "Mr. Holmes, I am a ruined man. Or at least I shall be ruined within the fortnight if this diabolical business is not stopped. My mind is giving way. I have begun to doubt my own sanity. I am haunted, sir, haunted by unseen forces that are destroying my life's work in the dark of the night." "Haunted?" I ejaculated, leaning forward in my chair. "Ghosts, Doctor." "Watson," Vamberry said, fixing his hollow eyes upon me. "Or demons. I know not what to call them, but they operate in the pitch-blackness of my deepest cellars, and they are turning my most priceless vintages into absolute, undrinkable filth." Holmes's eyes lit up with that sudden, fierce intensity that always seized him when a problem presented itself. He struck a match, lit his pipe, and settled back into his chair, puffing out thick clouds of blue smoke. "Let us proceed with order," he said smoothly. "Begin at the beginning, Mr. Vamberry. Tell us of your firm, your cellars, and the exact nature of this haunting." "My grandfather founded the firm of Vamberry and Sons in the year 1810, our client began, his voice trembling slightly, but gaining strength as he spoke of his heritage. "We specialize in the finest and rarest of European wines. We do not deal in the common clarets and cheap sherries that flood the London taverns. Our clients are dukes, earls, and occasionally royalty. To supply such a clientele, we maintain vast subterranean cellars beneath the old streets near Queen Hithe, cellars that, in some parts, date back to the Roman occupation of Londinium. They are deep, cool, and utterly still, the perfect environment for the laying down of fine wines." "I know the area," Holmes interjected, "a labyrinth of ancient brickwork and damp stone." "Precisely," Vamberry agreed. "Now, Mr. Holmes, 3 months ago I acquired a prize that was to be the crowning glory of my career. Through a private estate sale in France, I purchased 12 casks of an exceedingly rare, unfortified Bordeaux from a legendary chateau. This wine was laid down in the year 1847. It is irreplaceable. The casks alone, crafted of the thickest, most ancient French oak, are marvels of copperage. The value of this acquisition is astronomical. I placed these 12 casks in the deepest and most secure of my vaults, a chamber we call the inner crypt, which is secured by a heavy iron door." Vamberry paused, his face twisting in an expression of profound agony. For 2 months all was well. The wine rested. Then, exactly 5 days ago, I went down to the inner crypt to draw a small sample for Lord Blackwood, who was considering purchasing 3 of the casks. I opened the bung of the first cask. I drew out a glassful. "Mr. Holmes, it was not wine." "What was it?" I asked. "It was vinegar!" Vamberry cried, his voice rising to a distressed pitch. "Pure, harsh, acidic vinegar. It burned my nose before I even tasted it. I was astounded. Wine, as you may know, can spoil over a long period if exposed to air and warmth, turning to acetic acid. But this was a sealed cask in a frigid cellar. It defies all laws of chemistry for it to turn so thoroughly, so violently, overnight." Holmes leaned forward, his pipe held loosely in his hand. "Overnight? You are certain?" I had sampled that very cask only 2 days prior to ensure it had settled after its journey from France. It was perfect, a nectar of the gods. 48 hours later it was fit only for pickling onions. "A singular phenomenon," Holmes murmured, a gleam of pure intellectual avarice in his eyes. "And the other casks?" "That is where the terror truly begins," Vamberry whispered. "Finding the first cask ruined, I tested the second. It was perfectly fine. I tested the third. Also perfect. I assumed some freakish, inexplicable contamination had affected only the first. I locked the cellar and went home, shaken but grateful that 11 casks remained. The next morning I returned to the cellar. I tested the second cask. It, too, had turned entirely to vinegar during the night." "Fascinating," Holmes whispered, rubbing his long, thin hands together. "Absolutely fascinating. And the third day?" "The third cask was ruined," Vamberry said, burying his face in his hands. "Every night another cask falls. 5 casks are now destroyed. But the chemical impossibility of the spoilage is not what has driven me to the brink of madness, Mr. Holmes. It is the sound. The sound? Yes. After the third cask fell, my cellarman, old Higgins, a man who has worked in those vaults for 40 years, refused to go down. He claimed the inner crypt was cursed. To prove him a fool, I determined to spend the night in the cellar myself. I took a dark lantern, a thick coat, and a loaded revolver, and I locked myself in the inner crypt. Vamberry shuddered violently, and I poured him a measure of brandy from the tantalus on our sideboard. He drank it down in one gulp before continuing. I sat in the pitch blackness, surrounded by the great oak casks. For hours there was nothing but the dripping of condensation. The silence in those depths is absolute. Then, shortly after 2 in the morning, it began. "Pray, describe it with the utmost precision," Holmes said, his eyes closed, as though he were visualizing the scene. "It started as a whisper," Vamberry said, his voice dropping to a low, breathless register. "A dry, rasping sound. Then it grew. It multiplied. It sounded like 1,000 tiny fingernails scratching desperately at the wood from the inside of the casks. A frantic, ghostly scratching, echoing and amplifying in the vault until it seemed to fill the entire room. It was everywhere at once. It sounded as though the spirits of the dead were trapped within the very timber, clawing their way out. I am not a cowardly man, Mr. Holmes, but sitting in that black, freezing tomb, listening to that unearthly scratching. My nerve broke. I fled. I ran up the stairs and burst out into the street, leaving the cellar door wide open. And the next morning? The 4th cask was vinegar. Holmes sat perfectly still for a long moment, the smoke from his pipe wreathing his sharp, ascetic features. "And you have reported this to the police?" "I brought Inspector Lestrade down yesterday," Vamberry replied bitterly. "He listened to my story, tasted the vinegar, and laughed in my face. He told me that wine spoiling is a matter for a vintner, not Scotland Yard, and that the scratching I heard was merely rats in the walls. Rats! As if a man who has spent 40 years in cellars does not know the sound of a rat. This was no rat, Mr. Holmes. The sound came from the casks themselves. Lestrade's imagination rarely extends beyond a jemmy and a dark lantern," Holmes remarked dryly. "Now, Mr. Vamberry, let us descend from the realm of ghosts and spirits to the solid ground of earthly motive. Cui bono? Who stands to benefit from the ruin of Alexander Vamberry?" Our client hesitated, his brow furrowing deeply. "There is no one who benefits directly. The loss of the wine is my loss alone. But if you are asking who wishes me ill, I must mention the name of Horace Culverton." "Ah," Holmes said softly, his eyes snapping open. "The plot thickens. Who is Horace Culverton?" "He is a rival wine merchant. His premises are situated directly adjacent to mine on Thames Street. In fact, our cellars share a thick party wall of ancient Roman brick. Culverton is a strange, unpleasant man. He spent many years in the tropics, Brazil, I believe, or perhaps the West Indies, before returning to London to set up his trade. He deals mostly in exotic rums and fortified wines. 6 months ago he approached me with an offer to buy my firm. He wished to expand his cellars into mine. The offer was insultingly low, and his manner was exceedingly arrogant. I showed him the door. "Did he make any threats?" I asked. "He smiled," Vamberry said, shivering at the memory. "A cold, reptilian smile. He said, 'The old oak rots, Mr. Vamberry. Sometimes it rots much faster than one expects. I thought nothing of it at the time, merely the sour grapes of a defeated rival. But now, with my casks rotting overnight— "A suggestive remark," Holmes noted, writing the name upon his shirt cuff. "Is Culverton a man of scientific bent? I know little of his private life, save that he's a bachelor and keeps entirely to himself. Old Higgins tells me that strange, heavy crates are sometimes delivered to Culverton's warehouse at all hours of the night, crates marked with foreign shipping stamps." Holmes sprang to his feet with the sudden, explosive energy that characterized his transitions from thought to action. "Excellent, Mr. Vamberry. You have presented me with a most refreshing little puzzle. The unseasonal weather, the chemical impossibility, the ghostly acoustics, and the sinister neighbour with a tropical background. It is a veritable symphony of oddities." "You will help me, then?" Vamberry asked, rising unsteadily. "I will do more than help you. I shall solve your mystery," Holmes declared, tossing his pipe onto the mantelpiece. "Watson, if you will be so good as to fetch your hat and your revolver. We are going to pay a visit to the haunted crypts of Queen Hythe." Within 10 minutes we were seated in a closed four-wheeler rattling eastward toward the city. The bright sunshine of Baker Street gradually gave way to the hazy, smoke-laden atmosphere of the industrial riverfront. Holmes sat in the corner of the cab, his chin resting upon his chest, his eyes closed. He was in his deep analytical trance, and I knew better than to interrupt him. I occupied myself by watching the crowded streets of the Strand and Fleet Street roll past, wondering how on earth my friend intended to connect the rapid oxidation of wine with a man who dealt in Caribbean rums. "It is a question of chemistry and biology, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, answering my unspoken thoughts. "Tell me, as a medical man, what is the process by which wine becomes vinegar?" "It is a simple fermentation," I replied, pleased to be on familiar ground. "The alcohol in the wine is oxidized by a bacteria which converts the ethanol into acetic acid. But it is a slow process, and it absolutely requires the presence of oxygen." "Exactly," Holmes cried, tapping his walking stick upon the floor of the cab. "It requires oxygen. A sealed oak cask is virtually airtight. A minimal amount of oxygen permeates the wood over decades to age the wine, but a massive sudden influx of oxygen is required to turn a whole cask to vinegar overnight. Ergo, the casks are no longer sealed." "But Vamberry said the casks were perfect." "To the naked eye, perhaps," Holmes said, his eyes glittering. "But we must look closer, Watson. We must look much closer." We alighted near the chaotic, bustling wharves of Queen Hythe. The air here was heavy with the smell of the river, mingled with the sense of tar, damp hemp, and roasting coffee. Vamberry led us through a narrow cobblestone alleyway to a heavy oak door set into a grim, windowless brick facade. "This is the entrance to the cellars," he said, producing a large iron key. "The warehouse and offices are above, but we shall go directly down." He unlocked the door, revealing a flight of worn stone steps descending into the darkness. Vamberry lit a dark lantern he had retrieved from an alcove, and we followed him down. The descent seemed endless. The air grew perceptibly colder with every step, and the chaotic noises of the London street faded away, replaced by the hollow, echoing sound of our own footsteps. At the bottom of the stairs we found ourselves in a vast, vaulted undercroft. Massive brick pillars supported a ceiling that vanished into the shadows. Racks of dusty bottles stretched away into the gloom like the catacombs of Paris. The air smelled of damp earth, old glass, and the sharp, unmistakable tang of vinegar. "The inner crypt is at the very back," Vamberry whispered, his voice trembling as he led the way. We passed through a series of heavy wooden doors until we reached a solid iron portal. Vamberry unlocked it with a second key and pushed it open with a grating groan. He held up his lantern, and its beam swept across the room. It was a large, circular chamber, clearly of great antiquity. The walls were constructed of narrow Roman bricks, heavily crusted with white saltpetre. In the centre of the room sat 12 massive oak casks resting upon heavy wooden cradles. The air here was thick and heavy, and the stench of vinegar was overpowering. Holmes stepped past Vamberry, his face a mask of intense concentration. He drew a magnifying glass from his pocket and approached the first cask in the line, one of the ruined ones. "Bring the lantern here, Mr. Vamberry," he commanded. For a long time Holmes stood perfectly still, examining the surface of the thick oak staves with his lens. He moved his head slowly, his nose practically touching the wood. He inspected the bung, the iron hoops, and the grain of the timber. Then he dropped to his hands and knees, crawling along the damp stone floor beneath the cask, sweeping the beam of the lantern over the stones. "Ah," he murmured softly. "Have you found something?" I asked, peering over his shoulder. Holmes moistened his finger and touched it to the stone floor. When he held it up to the light, I could see a tiny smudge of pale powder clinging to his skin. "Dust," Vamberry said dismissively. "The cellar is full of it." "This is not cellar dust," Holmes replied, pulling a small glass vial from his pocket and carefully scraping the powder into it. "It is wood dust, the very finest sawdust, finer than flour. And look here, Watson." He pointed his lens at the underbelly of the great oak cask. I leaned in and squinted. At first I saw nothing but the rough, dark grain of the wood, but as my eyes adjusted I noticed a tiny, perfectly circular hole, no larger than the head of a pin. I looked closer and saw another, and another. There were hundreds of them, peppering the thick oak like the pores in a man's skin. "Good heavens," I breathed. "The cask is riddled with holes." "Microscopic perforations," Holmes said, his eyes shining with triumph. "Bored straight through 3 inches of solid French oak. The structural integrity of the cask is maintained so it does not leak liquid, but it has been rendered entirely porous to the air. The sudden influx of oxygen rushing into the vacuum catalyzed the rapid oxidation of the wine. The ghostly scratching you heard, Mr. Vamberry, was not the dead trying to escape. It was the living trying to get in." "The living?" Vamberry gasped, retreating a step. "What living thing can bore through 3 inches of oak overnight?" "That is what we must ascertain," Holmes said, standing up and brushing his knees. "Now, Mr. Vamberry, I must ask for absolute silence. We shall put your ghostly acoustics to the test." Holmes walked to the very centre of the circular room. He looked up at the vaulted ceiling, which formed a perfect parabolic dome. "Stand by the door, Watson. Mr. Vamberry, stand beside him." We did as instructed. Holmes remained in the centre of the room. He reached into his pocket and drew out his silver watch. With a deliberate motion he placed the watch upon the flat top of one of the casks. The silence in the room was absolute. Then, suddenly, a sound filled my ears. It was a rhythmic, metallic ticking, incredibly loud and sharp, as though a grandfather clock were standing right beside me. Yet the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the curved walls and showering down from the ceiling. "Astonishing," I whispered. "A perfect whispering gallery." Holmes's voice came from the centre of the room, though it sounded as if he were whispering directly into my ear. "The architectural curvature of this Roman vault acts as an acoustic mirror. Any sound generated near the focal point of the casks is amplified 100-fold and projected throughout the chamber. The chewing of a single insect would be barely audible. The chewing of 10,000 insects would sound exactly like your frantic, ghostly scratching." "Insects!" Vamberry cried, his fear suddenly replaced by bewilderment. "You are telling me that bugs ruin my wine?" "Not just any bugs," Holmes said, retrieving his watch and striding back toward us. "Specialized, highly voracious subterranean beetles. And unless I'm very much mistaken, they are currently at work on your 6th cask." Holmes moved down the line to the first unspoiled cask. He laid his ear against the thick oak. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. "Listen," he commanded. I placed my ear against the wood. At first I heard nothing. Then, beneath the silence, I detected it, a faint, dry, rhythmic rasping. It was the sound of tiny mandibles tearing at the ancient timber. Because I was right next to it, the acoustic trick of the room did not amplify it, but the reality of it was far more chilling than any ghost. "They are already halfway through," Holmes said, turning away. "By morning this cask will be vinegar. Come, Watson. We have gathered all the data this crypt can provide. We must return to Baker Street immediately." "But what of my wine?" Vamberry protested. "Are you going to leave them to destroy another cask?" "I am afraid we must sacrifice the 6th cask to save the remaining 6, Holmes said firmly. "I need an hour with my microscope and my reference books. Do not return to this cellar, Mr. Vamberry, under any circumstances. Watson and I will meet you here tonight at 11 o'clock, and bring your revolver. The beasts may be small, but the man who commands them is exceedingly dangerous." The journey back to Baker Street was accomplished in near silence. Holmes was a coiled spring of nervous energy, his mind racing through the implications of our discovery. Upon arriving at our rooms, he immediately threw off his coat, dragged his brass microscope to the window to catch the afternoon light, and carefully tipped a fraction of the wood dust from the vial onto a glass slide. For nearly an hour he peered through the eyepiece, occasionally adjusting the focus and muttering to himself. Finally he sat back with a sigh of profound satisfaction. "It is exactly as I suspected, Watson. Look for yourself." I took his place at the microscope and peered down the brass tube. Amidst the granular fragments of oak dust there lay a tiny crushed organic form. It was a minuscule insect, no larger than a speck of pepper, with a hard, dark carapace and disproportionately large, menacing mandibles. "What is it?" I asked, repulsed by the tiny monster. "It is a member of the family, the wood-boring beetles," Holmes explained, pacing the room with long, rapid strides. "But it is a highly irregular specimen. The common European death-watch beetle, or the powder-post beetle, takes months, sometimes years, to bore through hardwood. This creature, however, possesses mandibles coated with a natural, highly acidic secretion that softens the wood before it bites. It is a biological marvel, capable of tunnelling through solid oak with terrifying speed. Where does it come from? That is the crucial question. I recalled reading a monograph on the subject by the French entomologist Fabre. Allow me. Holmes went to his bookshelf and pulled down a heavy leather-bound volume. He flipped through the pages rapidly until he found what he was looking for. Ah, here it is. A subterranean beetle native only to the deep rainforests of the Amazon basin. It feeds exclusively on the hardest ironwoods of the jungle. It is practically unknown in Europe. "The Amazon!" I cried. "But Vamberry said that Horace Culverton, his rival, spent years in South America." "Precisely, my dear Watson. The chain of deduction is complete. Culverton, failing to buy out Vamberry's business through legitimate means, resorted to sabotage. He utilized his knowledge of exotic entomology to import a colony of these voracious beetles. He bred them, Watson, starved them, and weaponized them. But how does he introduce them to Vamberry's casks? The inner crypt is locked. You recall Vamberry mentioned that Culverton's cellar shares a party wall with his own? Holmes asked, his eyes gleaming. The Roman brickwork. Culverton does not need a key to the door, he merely needs a fissure in the mortar. He introduces the beetles through the wall. But beetles, Watson, are mindless creatures. They do not know a prize vintage from a common ale barrel. How does Culverton direct them so precisely to the exact casks he wishes to destroy, one by one? I frowned, thinking of my own medical knowledge. A chemical attractant? A pheromone? Excellent, Watson. You surpass yourself. Yes, a localized attractant. Something painted onto the target cask that draws the hungry swarm relentlessly toward it. To prove this, we must catch Mr. Horace Culverton in the very act of directing his microscopic army. The evening dragged on with agonizing slowness. Holmes busied himself by cleaning and loading his revolver, while I tried in vain to read a novel. At 10:30, we slipped out into the foggy London night and made our way back to the docks. Vamberry was waiting for us at the alleyway entrance, shivering in a heavy Ulster coat. His face was pale in the light of the street lamp, but he gripped a heavy Webley revolver with determination. "I have lost the 6th cask, Mr. Holmes," he whispered as we descended the dark stone steps into the undercroft. "I can smell the fresh vinegar." "Tonight we put an end to the destruction," Holmes replied softly. We reached the heavy iron door of the inner crypt. Holmes instructed us to leave the dark lantern outside. We slipped into the pitch-black chamber, relying entirely on touch to navigate. Holmes guided us to the far side of the room, behind the massive cradles of the remaining 6 casks, so that we were facing the shared Roman brick wall that separated Vamberry's cellar from Culverton's. "Not a sound," Holmes breathed into my ear. "We may have to wait some time." The darkness was absolute. The silence was heavy and oppressive, broken only by the distant muffled dripping of water and the shallow breathing of my companions. As we crouched there on the cold stone floor, the dampness seeped into my bones. For an hour nothing happened. I began to wonder if Culverton had somehow sensed our presence. Then, just after midnight, the silence was shattered. It began exactly as Vamberry had described it, a faint, dry whisper. In the perfect acoustic dome of the vault, the sound was immediately magnified. It grew louder, faster, more frantic. It sounded like a horde of spectral rats clawing at the timber from within. It was an uncanny, deeply unsettling noise that seemed to vibrate in my very teeth. Beside me I could feel Vamberry trembling violently. Suddenly, a faint scrape of mortar sounded from the wall directly opposite us. I strained my eyes in the darkness. A tiny pinprick of yellow light appeared in the centre of the ancient brickwork. The light grew slightly larger, revealing a narrow fissure where the mortar had been carefully scraped away from the other side. Through this fissure, a long, thin object was inserted. It appeared to be a narrow glass tube, extending several feet into the room. A moment later, a second object emerged, a long, slender pole with a small sponge attached to the end. The sponge was pressed gently against the side of the seventh cask, painting an invisible streak upon the oak. The scratching sound of the beetles in the sixth cask suddenly ceased. A new sound began, a soft rushing noise like the pouring of fine sand. Through the faint yellow light of the fissure I saw a dark, undulating stream pouring out of the glass tube. It was a river of tiny black insects, cascading onto the floor and immediately scrambling toward the sponge-painted streak on the seventh cask. "Now, Watson!" Holmes roared. The flare of a struck match momentarily blinded me. Holmes lit the dark lantern and threw the beam directly onto the wall. The sudden burst of light revealed the horrific swarm of thousands of beetles swarming over the oak staves. "Into the next cellar, quickly!" Holmes shouted, drawing his revolver and dashing for the iron door. We followed him out of the crypt and ran up the stairs to the alleyway. We sprinted around the corner to the entrance of Culverton's warehouse. The heavy door was locked, but Holmes did not hesitate. He raised his revolver and fired a shot directly into the lock mechanism. The metal shattered, and I kicked the door open. We plunged down Culverton's cellar stairs, our lanterns swinging wildly. At the bottom we burst into a room identical in shape to Vamberry's, but piled high with crates and exotic shipping containers. Standing by the party wall was a tall, skeletal man with a sallow complexion and a sparse, unkempt beard. He was hastily trying to pull a glass funnel and a long pole from a hole in the brickwork. At the sight of us, he dropped his tools and lunged for a heavy iron crowbar resting on a crate. "I wouldn't, Mr. Culverton," Holmes said, his voice cold and sharp as a scalpel. He levelled his revolver squarely at the man's chest. "Dr. Watson is an excellent shot, and Mr. Vamberry here looks as though he would thoroughly enjoy putting a bullet through your knee." Culverton froze, his dark eyes darting from the gun barrel to our faces. A sneer of pure, venomous hatred twisted his lips. "You meddling fools! You have no right to break into my property. And you, sir, have no right to loose your Amazonian pets upon your neighbour's property," Holmes retorted, stepping forward. He glanced at the makeshift apparatus on the floor, a large glass jar teeming with thousands of the black beetles, and a small pot of clear, pungent liquid. Holmes picked up the pot and sniffed it. "Ah, a concentrated yeast extract laced with an oxidized sugar compound, the perfect synthetic attractant for a starved beetle. You starved them in the glass jar, pushed them through the wall, and painted the target cask with this nectar. They swarmed over the wood, their acid-laced mandibles boring microscopic holes in a matter of hours in their desperate attempt to reach the food source. The holes allowed the oxygen in, the went to work, and the wine was ruined by morning. A brilliantly wicked scheme, Mr. Culverton. It is a pity your talents are not applied to honest entomology." "He ruined my life!" Vamberry roared, stepping forward, his face purple with rage. "I refused his paltry offer, so he sought to destroy me." "A common motive," executing an uncommon crime," Holmes said smoothly. "Watson, if you would be so good as to step upstairs and blow your police whistle. I believe Inspector Lestrade will be highly interested to see the true nature of Mr. Vamberry's ghosts." The subsequent arrival of the police, the arrest of Horace Culverton, and the chaotic sealing of the party wall occupied us until the early hours of the morning. It was not until the pale dawn was breaking over the Thames that Holmes and I finally found ourselves seated once more in our hansom cab, rumbling westward toward Baker Street. Holmes leaned back against the cushions, his eyes closed, a look of serene satisfaction upon his sharp features. "A most instructive case, Watson," he murmured. "It reinforces my long-held belief that the most profound mysteries are often rooted in the smallest of creatures. Culverton was a clever man. He understood that violence or arson would immediately cast suspicion upon him. But biological sabotage, a microscopic army that leaves no trace but ruined wine and a ghostly acoustic echo, it was very nearly the perfect crime. But he made one mistake, I noted. He made several, Holmes corrected, opening one eye. He underestimated the chemical impossibility of his timeline, which drew my attention. He utilized an insect native to a region he was known to have inhabited, which provided the link. And, most fatally of all, he failed to account for the acoustic properties of a Roman vault. Had Vamberry not heard the scratching of those tiny mandibles amplified by the parabolic ceiling, he might never have sought my aid, and Culverton would have succeeded in driving him to bankruptcy. "And what will happen to the beetles?" I asked, shuddering at the memory of the black swarm. "I have instructed Lestrade to flood the cellar with sulphur dioxide," Holmes replied, stifling a yawn. "The bugs will be eradicated, the wall sealed with modern cement, and Vamberry's remaining 6 casks of 1847 Bordeaux will mature in peace, though I suspect he will never enter that cellar again without a lantern and a very large boot." We arrived at Baker Street just as the sun broke through the morning mist, casting a golden light over the pavement. As we climbed the 17 stairs to our sitting-room, the lingering smell of Holmes's coal tar experiment greeted us, smelling suddenly like the sweet perfume of home. "Well, Watson," Holmes said, throwing himself into his armchair and reaching for his violin, "the criminal world has obliged us with a momentary diversion. But the game is over, the beetles are bested, and I fear we are doomed once more to the quiet agony of a peaceful London spring." And with a flourish of his bow, my friend launched into a complex melancholy sonata, closing the book forever upon the singular adventure of Vamberry the wine merchant. Thank you for watching. Before you go, don't forget to check out our Patreon.